question to you, what happened to you, is how did you, or was there a point where you decided to choose love and not the violence?
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing in the first century that made me choose love rather than violence was the fact that I allowed myself to feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of violence. To really feel it, like to grieve it, to really feel what it was like to be attacked and, belittled and then, of course, even more extreme, like put into places where you physically were harmed and so forth. I allowed myself to feel it. In the process of feeling it, the biggest feeling that developed in me was I don't ever want to do that to anybody else.
Can you qualify that actually by saying you felt it, but you attributed the effect to the correct cause?
Yeah, I didn't blame myself for it.
You didn't blame yourself, you didn't blame society, you said this is...
Well, what I blamed was the sin in society. What I could start to see was if my father wanted to, belt me and everything, and then he wanted to put me into a military college, if you want to call it that. It was actually run by some ex-Roman soldiers who were quite violent and also quite dark and like malevolent. If he wanted to do all of that, and I, was forced to go there. There was no choice. I was only 5 anyway, and it was forced to go there. So if he wanted to do all of that, I could see, that meant that he had some problems. I didn't think I had problems coping. I thought, because I didn't cope. Like when I say I didn't cope, I cried almost every day there for 2 years, right? I handled it in the sense of dealt with it, but I didn't come out toughened up. In fact, if anything, because I allowed myself to feel, I come out more soft and going, I'm never going to do that to anybody again myself. I'm never going to do that myself. And I'm never going to agree with anybody doing it to anybody else either. Yeah.
You didn't call it human nature.
I didn't call it human nature. It was human malevolence. Evil. It was evil, what was done. Yeah? So you've got to name a thing for what it is.
The problem on earth is that we very often misconstrue, like we blame ourselves, or we say, oh, well, that's how it is, or we don't, even if we feel, sometimes we don't really grieve what it's actually about.
Yeah. Straight behind.
The truth.
When you were there and you knew the next day probably some bad thing was going to happen
every day,
how did you have the faith to not go into a desperation and to keep going, that it's going to stop someday? Or
by this stage, it caused me to start to feel about God, like whether God existed and what God's nature would be, and and every time I felt about God, I felt this sort of very loving presence, and also love for me. And the love that I felt for me, even though I was very young, but the love I felt for me, I basically spent a lot of my life in that period of my life sort of just feeling about spiritual things. And in a way, I was zoning out of what happened physically, in terms of detuning to a degree from my physical body, but I was also learning how to control my physical senses. It's one reason why I didn't experience any pain when I was crucified, because by that stage I'd learnt to experience pain without feeling it. Right? I'd learnt to control the physiological responses of my body, including my nervous system, by that stage. So it helped me in my future to develop these qualities that I had later. But I didn't know that at the time. It was just something that I decided to do. It's hard to. I could see that the people around me were deciding the opposite. So all of the boys, there were about 120 boys who had all been sent by their fathers, and they weren't mostly Jews, they were different religions, and most of them were Egyptians, actually, fathers who sent their sons to the same school. Because we were living in Alexandria, which is in Egypt at the time. But as a result, many of them I could see were choosing to do the very thing the soldiers were getting them to do, right? Out of agreement and acceptance and a lot of other things. And I could see how, like, the choice to do the wrong thing began sort of in small ways and led to bigger ways. You know, when we first started the school, there was all just this sort of words that were all used to try and toughen up the kids. But then those words turned into actions, and then those actions turned into abuse, and then the abuse oftentimes turned into torture. It was a gradual process which the Roman army used to desensitise all of their soldiers for warfare. And that process was being engaged by the leaders of this school, if you wanted to call it that. It's sort of like more like a compound. But and I could see, even at a young age, that it was destroying everybody. And I could let it destroy me or not. Now, at this stage, unbeknown to me, I had some relationship to God, but I didn't understand it. I wasn't aware of it, but it helped me develop more of a relationship with God that I became aware of, because I wanted somebody to help me, to get out of it. And I couldn't see any person on earth doing it. My own dad wasn't going to do it. My mother wasn't going to do it because she was too afraid of my dad. Eventually, what happened was the school, you could say the principals, but really what they were violent Roman soldiers, met with my father and said I was untrainable. And they said to him that if I stayed there, I would die. And they asked him whether they wanted that for me. Right? Because I was so resistive to everything by that stage. And when I say resistive, I refused to do pretty much everything. Right? And every time there was violence because I refused. Right? And in the end, they said, because of the strength of my will, they said they'd have to kill me to get, and I still wouldn't do what they wanted. They recognised that, but it took them 2 years to recognise they'd have to kill me and they still wouldn't get me to do what they wanted. And so they met with my father and told him that they're going to have to kill me to get, and even then I was still not going to do what they wanted. What was my dad going to do about that? And my dad decided to take me out. That's what happened. But only because they learned that my will was unbreakable. And in that time, by this stage I was 7, I knew my will was unbreakable. Right? Now, I had some advantages in the first century, and one of the advantages was I didn't inherit the sins of my father and my mother. Now, in this life it's been a very different experience. Like, it's taken me to this age to realise my will is unbreakable. Right? But in the first century, by the time I was 7, I knew it was unbreakable. The beauty of knowing that and the power that gives you as an individual, immense. I knew I could handle anything. I could handle it emotionally. I could handle anything happening to my body. I could handle anything happening emotionally to me, and I was unbreakable. Yep. It's a great thing to know about yourself. Yeah? Franz? Where is the mic that was here? Olga was next anyway. So.
I just wanted to ask, because you knew the people were doing painful things to you.
That it was wrong.
Yeah, that was wrong.
Yeah.
But how was it possible for you to not judge them? Because I think it's a different thing that you know someone does something wrong.
Well, in the process of them doing it, they demonstrated to me that had been done to them. You see, these men running this school were Roman soldiers, and they were retired, but they were Roman soldiers. And all of them, they, you know, in the process of their yelling and screaming at you, they tell you things about themselves, right? And one of the things they tell about themselves was their own experience of the same indoctrination, the same abuse. And, you know, one day you might get the chance of talking to Cornelius, one of our friends, and he will tell you he was taken from his parents at the age of 3 and put into one of these schools, right? And he became a Roman soldier, he became a centurion in the end. But it was through years and years of malevolent abuse. You follow? And so I could, you know, they told me that. They told me as if it was good. You know, they're telling me their experience of this happened to me and this, you know, like, you know, I'm doing this to you because this is how I learnt, that kind of thing. And in the process, they told me a lot about themselves, and that is that I should have compassion for them. Because they're these damaged adults who had murdered, you know, hundreds of people, but who had grown from these children that were taken from their parents out of a loving environment into this terribly malicious, hateful environment. And that's all they knew. And they had no capacity to reverse it. Like, when I say no capacity, these people had no self-reflection. They just thought, what happened to me? I'm going to visit on the next generation. Many of you have done the same with your own children. What happened to me? I'm either going to choose to not or choose to visit on my children. You know, and these guys said this was good, hardening you up, ready, getting you ready for the reality of war, right? The reality of fighting for a country. Yeah, and very violent, of course, but the reality was that they had also experienced the same as what they were doing to me, and even a bit worse, really, because most of them were taken as children. Like, when I say not 5-year-old, I mean 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, taken from their families and put into service. By the time they became teenagers, all of them were in military service. When I say teenagers, as soon as they had the height of an adult, so for most people that's like between 13 and 15, they were now in the army. But they had had 10 years. The reason why the Romans were such a huge military force was because they did this. They desensitised generations of children to enter the army, to fight for Rome. And they gifted them with citizenship as a reward, if you survived.
Jay, can you also say, I sort of feel from a scientific perspective, judgment is a mechanism we use to prevent emotion?
Our own
emotion, yeah. So
it's a way of externalising your own experience, judgment. It's a way of saying they're like, not just that they're at fault, because I could see these men were at fault, right? But also that they're substantially worthless is really what judgment is saying. When you judge another, you're saying they're worth less than you. And I couldn't say that about these guys. No matter what evil they were perpetrating, I could feel that they were just kids, really, in these violent adult constructs that they had learnt through their entire life, and they didn't even have the adult development to see they were doing the wrong thing. Yeah. So it's hard to judge someone like that. So, Franz?
Yeah, I mean, if you stayed there for 2 years with so much humility, it must have been quite a powerful effect as well for the educators. I mean, it must have been really kind of hard for them.
It had a powerful effect on them in the sense they couldn't, coming to terms with the fact that they had to kill me and they still couldn't get me to do what I wanted. See, normally, with any child that they'd come into contact with up until that point, and by the way, both of the men are now celestial spirits.
Of course.
Right? So, but because of all of this that happened, right? But they realised at this point that my will was unbreakable And as a result of it being unbreakable, they would have to kill me. And then, of course, they were getting paid by my father to educate me. And, of course, if they killed me, Dad's not going to be too impressed, right? So that's why they eventually had a discussion with my father about it. Yeah? You understand?
But, yeah.
I don't want to labour this. It's just an experience I had. But I'm trying to share with you the principle that I'm not to blame for how you use your will, but I am responsible for how I use mine. Yeah.
But at the same time, it reminds the others of how wrong they are doing if there is like one kind of right person, and it's actually quite painful within them.
Yes.
Even if they distance.
It's partially why they got so violent, is because it was a reminder they were doing the wrong thing towards will. But also, it was also the reason why I was eventually removed from the situation.
Of course.
Yeah. So eventually, upholding love, I was automatically removed from the situation, even though the result could have been different, right? And that's happened to me all my life in the first century, and through this one actually, where I've been removed from situations. Once I've learnt the lesson of love, situations automatically stop and things change.